We start in Iran, where protests over the rising cost of living are spreading amid an economic crisis.
Iran, the central bank chief there, has resigned as the country's economic crisis continues to deepen.
Iran is facing an escalation of protests. Protests continue in over 100 settlements where people have risen up for freedom. However, in the heart of Tehran, there is a fire that is far more insidious and dangerous than the flames in the streets. These anti-regime marches, spreading wave after wave across 30 provinces, have today revealed a very critical and painful truth to the Iranian people. While the Iranian people are literally putting their lives on the line in the squares, allegations that the Khamenei regime is busy emptying the country's treasury have created a shock effect that changes the entire equation. One of Iran's largest and most established private banks has declared bankruptcy. On one side, the people are struggling for their lives. On the other, there is talk of $5.2 billion that has vanished into thin air. We will lay out the details of the billion-dollar unsecured loans distributed through the regime's bankrupt treasury, Ayandeh Bank, the tons of gold allegedly smuggled to Russia by Khamenei, and the horrific details contained in the secret collapse documents leaked from the central bank. Before delving into the details of this grand heist, the first thing we need to see are reports that more than 50 banks and state institutions across the country were torched or damaged while the regime was counting its money and gold behind the scenes. Among the damaged structures are Bank Keshavarzi, an agricultural bank allegedly linked to the Revolutionary Guards, Bank Kaparin, an entrepreneurial bank, Bank Simon, and Bank Etisad Novin, a new economy bank. The public was likely reacting very harshly to the regime's mismanagement and its meddling in the country's banking and financial sector. However, rather than being ashamed of this response from the Iranian people, the Tehran regime chose, as mentioned, a management style so bad and greedy that it would drive the country's banks into bankruptcy. This is precisely where Ayandeh Bank, the financial center of the scandal, comes into play. Ayandeh Bank, marketed by the regime under the guise of private banking, was actually a massive money laundering and wealth transfer mechanism set up for the Revolutionary Guards and the regime's elite. This mechanism fell apart during the critical period when protests shook Iran. The dark days of January 2026, which plunged the country into a total crisis, were triggered by the official bankruptcy of Ayandeh Bank. Let me emphasize this. This was not an ordinary bank failure or a typical bankruptcy. The bank's coffers were empty. The money that the people had saved from their hard-earned income, a total of $5.2 billion, had vanished into thin air and flowed directly into the pockets of the regime's elite. The massive $2.9 billion debt shown on the bank's balance sheet was actually just the tip of the iceberg. When the bank's assets were transferred to the state-owned Melli Bank by decision of the central bank, the horrific picture inside came to light. The bank had been operating for years like a Ponzi scheme. Payments were made to old investors with new deposits, but the real big funds were being poured into projects with no return. As our analysis deepened, the question of where these funds went led us to the regime's shadiest figures. Businessmen linked to the regime, such as Ali Ansari, who appeared to be the bank's owner. Data shows that over 70% of the bank's loans were transferred directly to companies associated with the bank, primarily massive and potentially non-reoverable construction projects like Iran Mall. Do you know what's even more alarming? 98% of the loans the bank issued were non-performing loans, meaning they were in default. In a healthy banking system, this ratio should not exceed 5%. However, the regime distributed a total of $1.3 billion in loans to 61 individuals without any collateral. These 61 individuals were not ordinary business people. They were key figures in the regime, the military command, and the bureaucracy or their proxies. While the people were suffering under inflation, these elites had emptied the bank through unsecured loans and had already transferred the money to offshore accounts or real estate. This is described by the Iranian people as literally an inside job. As the financial and monetary crisis scenario deepens in Iran, our technical investigation leads us to a much more critical document, a leaked, highly confidential directive from the Central Bank of Iran. This directive leaked around January 2nd, 2026, and marked confidential, suggested that the regime knew its end was near. This document may not be a routine security procedure, but rather a shelter protocol prepared for the impending disaster. According to this document, the Central Bank of Iran allegedly instructed all banks to switch to emergency mode. What did these instructions include? They ordered the transfer of critical financial data to secure locations, the activation of backup power systems against internet and power outages, and, most importantly, the preparation of alternative payment networks in case the regime lost control. The document clearly admitted that the regime was simulating its own collapse and preparing for it. Combined with the alleged regime budget went to war, notes left at ATMs on the streets, and rumors of cyber attacks, the banking system effectively shut down. However, the most striking and darkest aspect of the investigation is not on the ground, but in the sky. While the financial system was being undermined from within, radar data and air traffic records tell us a completely different story. A story of escape. Between December 27, 2025 and January 1, 2026, Russian IL-76TD cargo planes, masked with civilian codes, established a veritable air bridge between Tehran and Mineral Nevadi. These planes were not flying randomly. Aviation data shows that these planes were operating according to military logistics doctrine, based on the principle of maximum load, minimum waiting time. Statements by British MP Tom Tugendhat and intelligence reports confirm this. These planes brought weapons and ammunition to Tehran while taking off with suspiciously heavy loads on their return flights. So what were these heavy loads? Claims that these loads were Iran's national treasure, gold reserves, and cash foreign currency may be decoding the regime's Plan B. Just like Bashar al-Assad did, our Khamenei and his inner circle smuggling everything of value to Russia from the sinking ship. The fact that these flights are avoiding NATO airspace and flying over the Caucasus may indicate that this is a pre-planned evacuation operation. According to Belarusian opposition media, while the regime elites distract the people on the streets with the foreign powers fairy tale, they have already begun the plan to transfer the country's future to Moscow in the form of pallets full of gold. Those digital transactions emptying bank and those cargo planes flying to Moscow are not just numbers. The shockwave created by this corruption network has reached the market stalls in the remotest corners of Iran, the tables of the poor, and the anger in the streets. The economic indicators turning red have gone beyond being a statistic on the field and have become a survival issue that directly threatens people's lives. As of January 2026, the Iranian rial has seen its biggest devaluation in history, reaching 1.4 million against the dollar. This is not the currency becoming worthless, but the currency losing its meaning. Inflation exceeding 50% completely destroyed the purchasing power of the people. The impact of this economic crisis has caused a major breakdown not only in neighborhoods, but also among the bazaar merchants on whom the regime traditionally relies. Merchants in the Grand Bazaar of Tehran, Tabriz, Mashhad, and Isfahan have closed their shops. Those familiar with history will recall that in Iranian history, a bazaar strike has always been a harbinger of major revolutions. The economic power that overthrew the Shah in 1979 is now targeting Khamenei with death to the dictator slogans. Merchants who say closing our shops is our last resort are actually trying to cut off the regime's means of exploiting trade revenues, refusing to pay taxes, refusing to pay bills, and crippling the economy. This wave of civil disobedience, if you recall, resembles Ruhollah Khomeini's 1,980 tactic of paralyze the economy given to the Iraqi people. So, history repeats itself with cruel irony. To stop this massive wave of anger, the regime resorted to the method it knows best, its strategy of shutting down communication. The Tan regime planned to carry out its massacres in the dark by pulling the internet plug. However, this move was thwarted by a technological counterattack. Elon Musk's decision to activate his Starlink satellites for free for protesters in Iran ensured an uninterrupted flow of information. The images of the crowds in Transylvania district broke through the regime's wall of censorship. Now, no crime remains hidden. The regime's inhumane orders of oppression, the threats broadcast on television. Even in those moments, people are live streaming the atrocities to the world with their phones. The ripple effect of this process, which restored communication and albeit limited internet access, transcended geographical boundaries. We see that the protests spreading from Tehran have intensified significantly in Mashhad, the country's holiest city. There are claims that protesters have taken control of Mashhad, considered the ideological stronghold of the regime, and that security forces are confined to government buildings. It is noteworthy that Baluchi women in Zahedan chanted, "Pahlavi will return," while people in Karaj in the north shouted, "Our country will not exist unless the mullahs leave." Furthermore, The fact that Iran's ethnic and sectarian fault lines have united against the regime as one fist is seen as a complete nightmare for Khamenei. Even though the regime deploys its repressive apparatus, the Basij, funded by oil money, cracks are beginning to appear even within those security forces whose salaries are unpaid and whose futures have been stolen. So up to this point, we see a regime facing not only street clashes, but also a shock in the form of betrayal by its own elites. Khamenei's axis of resistance strategy has failed due to the escape plans of those who manage that very axis. The most critical indicator in this process is the phenomenon of abandoning ship. Allegations that the families of the regime's top figures, former President Hassan Rouhani and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, are knocking on Europe's doors have intensified. These elites lining up to apply for visas to the West, to France and Germany, reinforce the possibility of ideological bankruptcy. Those who preach martyrdom to their own people are planning a luxurious life of exile for themselves in Parisian cafes. This is the clearest picture of the regime's backbone breaking from within, of loyalty disappearing. Subscribe to RussiaWarX for real analysis beyond the headlines. Share this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and stay informed with RussiaWarX.